Hi, everyone. We're back again today, this time with Stuart McCallum with HHM, who's going to take us through a little bit of financial preparedness for the current crisis we find ourselves in. Thank you for being here, Stuart.
Thank you for having me. My name is Stuart McCallum. I'm an advisory partner with the CPA firm HHM here in Chattanooga. I'd like to thank the Chamber of Commerce for allowing us to be a resource to its members. Next slide, please. One more slide. So today what we'll talk about briefly is the virus, steps to protect your business, and then overall implementing a plan to help minimize the impact of the virus, which I know sometimes can seem a little bit daunting or overwhelming with everything that we see in the media and the impact that we see in our community. However, what we'll discuss today are some ideas to help compartmentalize a couple of those items. So first off, coronavirus and COVID-19, as it seems that people are now referring it to, like all news related to coronavirus, this chart was outdated the absolute second that we put it on the slide, right? So today's death count, I think, is about double that. I think we're at 15,436, give or take. So you could see here in a very short period of time, our world has literally been turned upside down due to COVID-19. So what we're going to talk about today are steps to protect your business, or steps that you could take in the direction of protecting your business. One more slide, please. So first and foremost, what we would recommend is that you review your insurance policy and agreements. So as some of you may be aware, there is an insurance policy known as business interruption insurance, which is sometimes called loss insurance. So this is a policy many of you may be familiar with that protects against lost income after a covered peril. Now, covered peril is a definition that we will talk about today. There are plenty of examples of peril that are clearly covered. For example, a client of mine a few years ago was directly impacted by a hurricane, destroyed their business, destroyed their facility, and they were unable to open. Whether your business interruption policy will cover this pandemic or COVID-19 is up for discussion, and more accurately, up for debate in the courts and Congress, which we will talk about a little bit later. But specifically, pandemic exclusions. So some of your policies may specifically call out pandemics and say that they are not covered. Most agreements, we believe, are relatively vague on this. And so for that matter, nearly 20 members of Congress I believe on Friday, issued a letter to the American Property Casualty Insurance Association to ask that they retroactively cover COVID-19 business interruption claims where it's not specifically spelled out that pandemic would be excluded. So that is agreements that are maybe vague. They've asked the insurance coverage or the insurance agencies to cover those losses without question. As you can imagine, insurance companies were not super fast to adopt that. Another type of insurance that I'd talk about today, which some of you may or may not be familiar with, is a specialty insurance product called supply chain insurance. So this is specifically for business interruption that is as a result of disruption or delay in either getting products, getting components for products, or services. So, for example, if you are a large landscaping company and you have mulch that you buy from various providers, you could insure that portion of that supply chain or of those suppliers, sometimes by name, but sometimes by category of supplies. Jeremy, one more slide, please. So what is defined as damage or loss? So what we're seeing right now are insurance companies struggling with this definition because historically, business interruption was because of physical loss or damage. That is the example that I told you about a client that was unfortunately in the path of a hurricane. A hurricane hit them almost directly, tore the roof off their building, destroyed their parking lot, destroyed their inventory, and destroyed the drive up from the road. Obviously, that put them out of commission, and there was a physical element to it. Historically, business interruption insurance has been tied to physical damage. However, what we're seeing today is that there's a little bit murkier water. I would mention an example in the New York Times, I believe 2 or 3 weeks ago, where they had noted that certain property could be damaged by being in the presence of somebody that with COVID-19. An example of this that I think would be readily obvious is a used car, via a car dealership, for example. If you have a vehicle that sits on the lot and you are unsure if the person before you took possession of it had COVID-19, you are unable to tell the buyer, the potential buyer of that vehicle, that it is not diseased or infected or whatever the nomenclature may be. Therefore, that vehicle may be worth less today purely because of this virus. So there's this weird middle ground where you could argue that you did suffer damage even if the actual building was not caught on fire or destroyed, as you see on these slides. You could argue that as a restaurant, maybe some of your leaseholds, tables, chairs, equipment, lighting, whatever the case may be, is damaged due to the coronavirus. So there's a little bit more wiggle room today than we have seen in the past, a lot more ambiguity. So as I mentioned, physical damage definition might be expanding to include things that may have come in contact with COVID-19. But Oceana Grill filed a lawsuit last week, a preemptive lawsuit that's been followed both by attorneys as well as insurance companies. This is a Cajun restaurant based in New Orleans that is arguing that due to mandated government shutdown, that they've experienced a loss of income. They are preemptively or have preemptively filed a suit in the court system even prior to filing a loss claim, demanding that the courts recognize and make a ruling as to whether or not virus or government mandated shutdowns or negative impacts to their business be covered by their general business interruption insurance. So this could be a pretty large ruling when it comes down. It has not come down yet. I just checked immediately prior to this. I wasn't able to find where a ruling had been made, but that one you should keep an eye out for. I have listed here the official name of the lawsuit in case you wanted to track it. Lastly, talking about damage or loss is a legal term called force majeure. So force majeure is a phrase that means really an act or will of God. So something that is outside of the control of both parties in an agreement. So an earthquake, a hurricane, a flood, although floods are sometimes carved out for property damage purposes, but from supplier agreements, force majeure usually includes those natural disasters, if you will. Force majeure is an interesting argument. I was talking to an attorney about this last week. The force majeure, absent other language, could be used under a business interruption insurance claim, if the language is in there, to file a claim based upon the negative impacts of coronavirus or COVID-19, especially when you do not have language in the agreement that specifically says pandemic or natural illness. I do know, just from my own experience, that some agreements will exclude pandemics, but be sure to read that language because sometimes the pandemic exclusion is specific to terrorism. So it's more biowarfare than what we are seeing here with COVID-19, at least to my knowledge. I would also look for vagaries in explanation of non-recurring events, acts of God, or things outside of your control. Again, the best resources for you are probably to talk to your insurance agent, which if you've had them for a long time, you probably consider them to be a friend. I would ask them what coverage you have and do not have under your current agreements. And then if it comes down to it, you could consult your CPA or attorney to help get a second opinion on the language that is in your agreements. But I would recommend immediately looking at your agreements. Here you'll see there's a lot of noise in your data right now. And if you really wanted to file or prepare a claim for business interruption, you need to have a good idea of what that damage is, right? So here is a perfect example of a bunch of noise. And Jeremy, if you just click once, within that noise is data that is important. I put this together, this slide, to illustrate that right now, there's probably so much going on with your business that you're running just to keep up. And so part of this presentation now we'll dive into are some items that we think would be of particular interest for you, that if you do plan to file a business interruption claim, that you have put together. So obviously, past financial statements. Monthly would be preferred, right? Because you could put together annual statements, but you'll lose some of the ups and downs in the interim. But here, you have a very clear line of demarcation where your business was likely started to be impacted. Here in Chattanooga, it seems that last week, everything kind of came to a head. We had some clients last Saturday, so not 2 days ago, but 8-9 days ago, that said that Saturday was absolutely phenomenal for their businesses. Restaurants were busy, people were in buying cars, people were in their retail shops. And then Sunday, Monday came around and the world stopped. So if you have granular financial statements or granular financial information, again, it's all the better to show where that loss period started and how far it went. To the extent that you are negatively impacted by delayed vendor shipments, missed vendor shipments, employees that aren't able to come in, again, you should document these things to the best of your ability. Keep them in a folder. Keep a notepad where you're just notifying or you're writing down phone calls that you're having with certain vendors, suppliers, if it negatively impacts your business. Right now, everything seems like a whirlwind. And when this is behind us in 2 months or 6 months or whatever that timing is, when you go back to defend your business interruption claim, there will be a lot of noise and a lot of water under the bridge. So your best advice right now is to document everything while it's clear and current. Any invoices that you paid, any actual property damage, I would collect business contracts and then employee wage statements. Anything that you can gather that paints a picture of your business. As I was talking to the colleagues at the Chattanooga Chamber of Commerce, there are some bills right now in the House, or in Congress rather, called the CARES Act, where there may be some reimbursement related to loans that are used for, very specific loans that are used for payroll expenses. Again, this could only help you with those claims in the future if you decide to take on and use those loans under those prescribed uses. The more document that you have, the more documentation that you have, the clearer documentation that you have can only benefit you in the long run whenever you're defending a claim or defending an action that you've taken today. Unrelated to business interruption claims now. So this is the portion of the presentation where we talk about protecting your business beyond insurance. What we recommend is that you map out your supply chains and that you profile each supplier so that you understand what their capabilities are, what their limitations are, and then ultimately what their game plan is. So there has been talk of businesses that were going to stay open. We'll take Tesla, for example, where Tesla was going to change from producing cars and producing HVAC systems and all the other things that they produce and focus on ventilators. In order for them to make ventilators, they would have to be sure that their supply chain can actually still deliver their products, right? So they're going to have plastic sheathing, they're going to have tubes, they're going to have some kind of bladders for their ventilators, whatever the case may be, electronic components. In order for them to manufacture those, they will have to make sure that each of their manufacturing relationships in that supply chain are still manufacturing the components that they need, right? So it's not just calling the supplier that brings you the electronic component. It's calling that supplier and seeing if they are still able to produce their product and what backlog they have or supply or inventory of their components that they have. So once we profile the risk of each supplier, we can then calculate the risk of each supplier and then understand what our exposures and opportunities are for those products. So here is a picture of your supply chain. And you may think that your supply chain is flatter than this, for example. But we'll take a restaurant. So a restaurant, if you serve soft drinks, may have a vendor that brings you the boxes of Coca-Cola, right? Which in turn is a plastic blow molded container inside a cardboard box, and inside that bladder is a mixture of sugar, water, coloring, whatever else may go into it. So already your beverage supplier needs to have the boxes, needs to have the bladders, and need to have the inputs for the actual liquids. And so they rely on what could be 3 or 4 outside suppliers themselves. So even if hypothetically you were able to stay open, you have this level of supply chain that you need to have visibility to. Jeremy, if you click just once, what's important to know is that in your current understanding of your supply chain, you likely have a visibility barrier. So that is, you know who sells you your soft drink, but you may not know who supplies your soft drink provider all of their inputs. Or, for example, Tesla knows who provides their circuit boards, video cards, whatever, but they may not know who provides the semiconductors for that. Those semiconductor manufacturers may have some kind of silicate provider or a metals provider below that. And so you will naturally run into a visibility barrier. I mention this because it is important to try to penetrate that visibility barrier, because here it may matter. Let's just say coronavirus cured itself tomorrow. Tomorrow at 12:30 in the afternoon, coronavirus all of a sudden disappears. For many businesses that don't have a backlog, they're going to have to rely on the 7th tier of supplier in this map, right? So the 7th tier will ramp up production, and maybe in 5 days, the 6th tier gets their product. And then 5 days later, the 5th tier gets their product, and so on and so forth. So if you are an assembler of goods that has 7 or 8 components that you're putting together for a final product, it's not so much that coronavirus is over, we can open the doors again, right? It's important to get an understanding of just how quickly you need to shut down right now. So if you have supply chain momentum still going in your favor, you should be able to calculate how long you can stay open. But then on the flip side, this is a helpful example or exercise to determine just how quickly you can also open on the other end. Because if you have 8 layers of suppliers and each one needs 3 days, then you're 24 days before you can start your business again. So this is an exercise that we do highly recommend you take on in assessing your business today. Reviewing advertising budget. So I heard this morning that on CNBC that there was a demand decline. So there's product out there, but there's a decline in demand. And so you could argue that there's a corresponding decline in advertising because you're going to have a slower turn of your inventory. But I would argue that this may open up additional opportunities, right? Jeremy, one click, please. So where you advertise matters just as much as what you spend on it or the content of the message. So this is a picture of, I believe, China in the morning commute. There are no cars around. So you could say, oh, well, I need to cut back on my advertising. But realistically, that advertising impact here is really for morning radio commute advertising, right? So I know a lot of us are working from home these days. You don't need to get in your car to drive to work, so that, let's say, 7:30 to 8:30 a.m. radio spot is really not going to get the same attention that it did before. That doesn't mean, though, that there aren't opportunities. You guys got to go where the people are. So here's a couple of headlines that probably mimic your own personal experience right now. Internet usage is soaring because people are using it at home, both for personal and business use. This is the way that remote employees stay in touch with their teams, with their bosses, with their firms. We now live in a very virtual and digital world. So if I was to advertise food delivery services, for example, the internet would be ground zero for me, no pun intended, for my advertising efforts, not necessarily radio or even TV. If I know my constituents are going to spend a considerable amount of time on the internet, then I would want to advertise there. And if it's food services, I'd probably want to advertise somewhere around 11 a.m. and noon, and then again probably 3 or 4 o'clock to advertise that dinner potential delivery services. So there's a lot of opportunity out there. We just have to make sure that we're balancing where we spend, not just slashing your ad budget, because there's still demand out there for some core products. I would argue, especially with younger professionals that maybe don't have never used their kitchen before, just because they're stuck at home doesn't mean that they want to cook. There may still be opportunities out there for food delivery. For businesses, whether you're doing well during this time or poorly, you really have to find a balance for internal communications. So now that the reality of the COVID-19 shutdown is hitting us all, we need to find that balance between being a cheerleader and Chicken Little. There are a lot of employees that are scared. They don't know what their job security situation looks like. There's a lot of families that were teetering on the brink before, right? And so a hiccup could throw them totally out of whack. So what we would recommend is having a frank and honest discussion with them, but also highlight the positives and try to find that balance. You don't want to give them false hope, but at the same time, there's enough stress right now that for our key employees, we don't want them to feel undue stress. We want them to focus on their job. We want them to focus on being productive. We want them to, and to the extent that we could keep their mind focused on the job and less so on their personal finances, it's all the better. I would caution, and this is a little bit industry specific. Every industry is going to be a little bit different, but I would caution business leaders when trimming headcount that they should do so with a scalpel, not necessarily with a hatchet. And specifically what I mean is that there are some employees within your organization that may not have executive roles, but may still be seen as leaders to your employees. So these may be older employees, these may be that have a lot of respect, These may be employees that have just been at the company a long time, right? So if you have a manufacturing company and you have a tool and die guy that's been there for 25 years, chances are he goes by a nickname. Everybody likes him. Everybody knows him. He has a lot of respect to the people around him, and he solves a lot of people's problems. To trim that person during this time could have a twofold negative effect. One, he may have a skill set that you are unable to replace. Again, God willing, coronavirus disappears tomorrow at 12:30 in the afternoon. Will you kick yourself that you no longer have that employee? And then two, does that person serve a leadership role, an unofficial leadership role within the organization, such that your other employees look up to him, and removing him or her from the organization has a negative impact for morale? I think we all know who those individuals are within our organizations. So I do just share that word of caution that when you're thinking or prioritizing how to trim headcount or how to trim expenses, that you do so carefully and intentionally. I'd like to thank you for taking the time to listen to me this afternoon. Jeremy, if we have any questions, I'm happy to take them. Jeremy, I see your mouth moving, but I do not hear you.
Sorry. Muted myself there while I was operating the presentation. No, thank you for being here, Stuart. I think this was really helpful for a lot of our members. If they are concerned and looking for help in some of these areas, is there somewhere you would send them to contact you guys if you can offer help going forward?
Yes, so my contact information here is on the screen. I'd also advise you to talk to your longtime legal counsel, financial advisors, anybody that you consider to be a trusted advisor. And we have a pretty small community of talented legal and financial professionals here in Chattanooga. If they don't have the answer, they should be able to point you in the right direction.
Okay. And I don't really see any questions coming through at this point. So again, I'll thank you once again for being here, Stuart. I think this was some really valuable information for folks. And we may reach out to you again if we need some guidance as this progresses.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you.